Good morning. What I want to do today is very quickly go over some of the prehistory and the cultural patterns that you see, especially in Western Micronesia. Wednesday, we'll go over the sort of Central Eastern part. So when you're looking at Western Micronesia, the most westernmost area is here. Let's switch this out. We're talking about Palau and the area around that. And as I mentioned, I think last week, when you look at this western area of Micronesia, there's a huge amount of influence from the Philippines. Strangely enough, not from the central Philippines, but actually from Luzon to the north. I'm not sure what that's about. That might have to do with sailing patterns. I'm not familiar with the sailing current systems in the Western Pacific here. But what you do find is you find the same type of, well, same patterns and very similar types of pottery to what you find here in the eastern part of Luzon. In the northeast part in Palau. You find rice. The only place you find it in the Pacific is in Palau. So what you have in many ways is a pattern which suggests that your initial settlement, or at least high impact settlement, was coming from here down to this particular area. This makes it a little bit different than there is in the rest of Micronesia, which tend to have a lot of their impact comes from the south, in Melanesia. So Palau's a little bit different in that regard. We're not sure exactly how that relates to what you see in the landscape, both historically and archaeologically. But it's important to remember, as with almost all the rest, well, essentially all the rest of Micronesia, we really do not have any legitimate, decent historic records. Again, the Europeans coming into this area were not particularly interested in the area. They tended to limit themselves to, for example, descriptions of reef and sailing directions to avoid running aground. But they didn't see the area as being interesting enough to actually get into detail what people were up to. Even in Guam, where the Spanish settled early on, they're totally disinterested in the Chamorros, except as a slave labor pool. So they don't spend any time, basically at all, talking about how the Chamorro tended to do stuff. So Palau, which doesn't even have that early impact, really is sort of off the charts. The first time Palau even gets mentioned pretty much in the European accounts is when the Germans take it over in the I'm going to say 1880s, I don't remember exactly when. And it becomes one of these German colonies in the Pacific. Even then, the Germans really don't send any anthropologists or other folks in to do a lot of studying. They didn't want to a large extent, as with the rest of Micronesia, I think they saw it sort of as a waste of their time. By the late 19th, early 20th century, the stereotype that the Micronesians were largely migratory populations who just sort of happened to end up on particular islands made it a lot less interesting to Europeans as to why they were there. Also, they'd come for some reason very early on to the conclusion that the Micronesians had nothing in common with Polynesians. Therefore, Micronesians weren't given this sort of favored status of being Europeans in the Pacific. So they weren't of interest. Where Micronesians came from wasn't of interest. And to be honest, with the exception of a few anthropologists, still isn't of interest in 2020. So your Micronesian region, sort of falls off the charts. In the case of Palau, that leaves us with a huge number of puzzles. Let's see here. I think if I do this region here. One of the things that the Europeans sort of noted early on, but they really just sort of noted it in passing, and they thought it was geologic, is the fact, if you notice this here, you have a bunch of regular lines. What you actually have here is a huge set of terraces that go all the way up to the top of most of the peaks. Almost every inch of the Palau Islands has been terraced. A staggering amount of effort was put into this, which in some areas like here, you can still see some of it left. Depending on where you go, in some areas it's really striking. And this was a huge puzzle. And again, but it says something that if this had been in Polynesia, the Europeans would have been all over this. They would have said, and it's something. It certainly would have been brought up there almost with the whole issue of stone statues on Rapa Nui, for example. But instead, because this is Micronesia, we can see it here. But this whole area has basically been modified. to an extent that we don't see anywhere else in the Pacific. Hawaii is probably the closest with a massive terracing, but that's limited to particular regions. A lot of New Caledonia or Nouveau Caledonie in Melanesia is heavily terraced. And that actually looks the closest to what you see in Blau, but there's no other evidence that there's any relationship between the two regions. I'm trying to see if I can find it really striking. You can sort of see it a little bit here. All this area that looks sort of like uplifts but the reason it looks so tidy is because it's all been terraced. So the place is just, it looks like I don't know, like a fancy cake or something like that. And this is true of this massive amount of real estate. We're not talking about small areas here. So when you look at these and you see these massive amounts of terracing, it's really, really, really quite striking. And it also leads to a huge puzzle, as with most of Micronesia. It's just exactly, how many people were here, what type of population political structure did you have in place, when was it in place, and to be honest, we don't know much. There's been very little work done in most of Micronesia. Blau is no exception. There's been a little bit more work done there, but very little. And again, this is because the Blau, as with much of Micronesia, moves from German hands to Japanese hands. The Japanese are probably even less interested in this region than the Germans are. So the end result is basically squat happens. The Americans take this place over, as with the rest of Micronesia, in 1945. In fact, they invade Blau. I remember that was one of the videos you saw a little bit of in late 1944, I think. So they take over this area and then manage it, if you want to call it that, until the 1990s. Blau is one of the areas that gets its, quote, semi-independence out of the Compact of Free Association, which is what it has now. But the end result is the local population has never been, I don't know if interested, I'm trying to avoid saying not interested, but it's not on their list of things they need priorities. So you don't see a lot there's basically no collected effort on the part of the local administration, the local government, to actually collect oral traditions and other material on Blau in an organized fashion. Same is true of the University of Guam, Geology, which is the big, sort of Micronesian Pacific campus. You don't have any equivalent like Vichy Museum or even with the Hawaiian Studies or something like that, where you've got a fair number of scholars in place that have been looking at this stuff. In the case of Hawaii, since the 1860s, and by 1920s, by 1900, a very pretty sophisticated archaeological program here, which then spills over to Polynesia by the 1920s, 30s. You don't see that in Micronesia, and sad to say, as we get into the 2020s, you don't see it today. And of course, what that means is all the older folks that would have any remaining knowledge are rapidly disappearing. There's been no attempt to grab that material before they disappear. And there's very little in the way of printed source material because you don't have literacy in this area. And literacy in Hawaii is common by 1835, 1840. That's not true here. So you don't have the local indigenous population writing stories about themselves or writing about stuff to each other. So we really have it's almost a vacuum. So you've got these enormous archaeological features that cover a large amount of the landscape. Really no clue as to what the hell's going on in terms of what made them, what the logic was behind them, and what purpose they served. So when you're looking at Micronesia, Blau is probably like the poster child of it. We know that, well, I should say we know because archaeologically the top of most of the high peaks had posts in the ground. So it looks almost like a Maori pa. But why that would be the case, we don't know. We don't have any oral traditions that say that this region was constantly in warfare with each other, which is, in the Maori cases, all sorts of stories about people invading each other, etc. The 40,000 population that I've got listed here is probably really on the low side, but that's like a minimum. If the terracing is agriculturally defined, which it appears to be, then the population could be significantly higher, but we still don't. One thing you do see here, and this was actually there were works done on this in the late 19th century, and then the whole thing sort of got poo-pooed and then has vanished, is in Blau, in much of Western Micronesia, all the way down to Vanuatu, and certainly throughout all of Indonesian stuff, you find large megaliths. The megaliths are large stone pillars or stone pieces that are carved. Usually with what looks like patterns like you see on either ceramics or tatau. So they're not, in many cases, they're not actually sort of like face effigies, things like the carved wood and stuff you'd see in Aotearoa or you know, Easter Island stone or something like that. It's back in the late 19th century that saw that as a common pattern to all of this in terms of these megaliths. And then a couple of books came out. Riesenfeld or something like that. I can't even remember his name now. I've been trying to find a copy for years. Wrote one of these, and then poof, everyone decides that's not accurate. That these megaliths don't show anything in common, and this whole discussion sort of vanishes. I suspect that was probably premature. Carving megaliths is not something that you see people do in many areas, and the fact that you see it in certain areas of the Pacific and not anywhere else really is sort of suspicious, especially when you see the same patterns in Taiwan, for example, and in Indonesia. Would suggest that maybe some sort of similarity or some commonality was taking place. But again, we just don't know. And it says something that you've got the megaliths in Blau and no one has a clue. And to be honest, there may be one or two people are even interested in it, and that's it. One thing you do see in this region throughout from basically, well, you see this also in the Philippines, Indonesia, but all the way through to basically central Micronesia, is the idea of very large buildings, very large homes, if you want to, sort of group homes. So they look in some ways almost like a Maori marae, but whereas a marae was a ritual center and a production center, and people lived outside of it. In Western and Central Micronesia, as in a lot of the rest of the Western Pacific, what you see are these really large clan houses up to maybe 140, 160, 180 feet long. So these long rectangular buildings with some interior divisions, but most of the interior is pretty open. They're usually raised off the ground. And usually the front has these very spectacular entrances. The most famous ones you'd see if you go to, for example, Micronesia. And in fact, in New Guinea, you still see smaller versions of these. Beautifully carved structures, which basically people, when you're entering it, it shows the history of the clan. So in that way, it is sort of like a mounting marae. The images on the front of the ancestors, the images also in the front illustrate the successes and power of the clan. So the folks in the immediate, maybe subsection of the clan live in one building altogether. So this could be upwards of maybe 40, 60, 80 people are living actually in one structure together. And they're all related to each other either by birth or by marriage. And so if you marry, you move into another house, but it literally is another house. So this idea of clan houses or large communal structures that are reflective of clan relationships is really typical in this area. You see this in Palau, the Palau region. You see it in Guam, the Marianas region. You see it all the way over to Pohnpei, Costa Rica and stuff, and FSM. So this idea of large centralized structures that reflect the group. And so what you find is that clans become a form of identity throughout this western half of Micronesia. And what it is then clans are ranked, just like sports teams, like football teams would be ranked in terms of wins and losses, and how successful they've been over the last, how many years. Clans in much of Western Central Micronesia have exactly the same thing. Everyone can tell you all the clans, everyone can tell you their successes and failures over a period of time. And so if you're someone from a successful clan, you're only going to marry someone from another successful clan. Now in this, what happens is, unlike in Polynesia, you don't find that the ancestor form becomes really central. This is something that's interesting about Micronesia. What you find in almost a Western, sort of European way, is success becomes the definer of relationships, not your past. And this appears to have been the case for a while, because this part appears to be pretty traditional. So in Western Central Micronesia, how successful the clan is will define who folks in the clan will marry in terms of other clans. Not are you simpatico or related, types of ancestors. And so that's sort of intriguing. And again, there's, what I'm telling you is pretty much what we know, because there's been so little work done. So, So as in the rest of almost all of Micronesia, with the exception of Guam in the historic period, we'll get back to that later. In Palau, what you have is the women control the land. So the women's clan control the buildings. You live within the houses of the women. You trace descent through your mother and your sisters and your aunties and stuff. So that's the system that's in place. In that situation, men are the ones that move around. So women don't move from houses, men do. Excuse me, I think I'm allergic to glass. So what happens is when men marry, they move to another house, which also means they're moving to another clan. Children are raised by their mom, or sisters, or aunties, and stuff like that. So children identify with the mother's clan. So it's a real matrilineal, matrilocal system in a sort of classic sense. And this is true for all our intents and purposes. For our purpose, let's just say that's true of all of Micronesia. Now, in that, what you'll find is you have this idea of men's associations, or a group of men that work and do stuff together. But those men will be the men that are women's brothers, cousins, and stuff like that. So even though the men might move out to another clan house, their affiliation is still to the clan they're born to in many cases. And so the men's association, but then, well, it also includes when a guy marries into another clan, when he moves into another house, he's expected to represent both of those groups. So what you find is men's associations are really important, but they're always controlled by the women. So it's sort of like the women decide what to do. They tell the men's group in the house, do this. The men go out and do that. So the men have to be organized, but the men aren't going to be autonomous. They're going to be doing what the women tell them to do collectively. So your political relationships are going to be defined and controlled by women. They're going to be manifested by the men. So the women's council is the key. And this is what, I think it came up in a discussion last week. This is what makes things so complicated in Micronesia in the 20th, 21st century, is the Germans, the Japanese, and the Americans all come in. All three of those groups are very patrilineal, totally male-dominated societies, especially the militaries. And so they actually totally ignore this idea of the women having any voice at all, especially the Japanese. Japanese society today still doesn't have any concept of women being in charge, really. So they just gut the system. They just ignore the women. And so what happens is from the period basically colonialism from the 1880s into 2020, what you get is men end up in increasing amounts of authority, but there's no traditional place to put them there. They end up in authority because the Europeans will only listen to them. Now, over time, what happens is the men realize, not surprisingly, that they can do what they want without checking with the women because the women don't have the ability to control them anymore. So this becomes a real complicated, very stressful situation in all of Micronesia, which has not been resolved yet. And it constantly pops up in politics and all sorts of other areas. This is the role of men's modern authority and women's traditional authority. In a cynical way, this might be one reason why in the political structures in most of Micronesia, you don't find a lot of research into the past, because that would take authority from the folks that have it now, men, and give it to women, the folks that used to have it. So there's probably not a lot of motivation to do a lot of research on traditional systems with the idea of bringing them back, because the group that's in power would lose power by that research, just as a thought. One of the most famous things that you find in this whole region of Western Micronesia is this idea of mani, in sort of the classic pigeon term. Large stone discs, sort of look like stone wheels, that you see scattered all throughout this area. These are usually, for the life of me, I can't remember if they're made here in the Godiac, or I think the stones come from here. Anyways, you'll find them scattered all throughout Western Micronesia. They're not the same as the megaliths. These were used right into historic periods. In fact, I believe just about 20 or 30 years ago, there were one or two of the monies that were still moving around. So these become, again, clans power. If a clan has a lot of stuff, a lot of resources, a lot of pull, they'll give resources to a group and get one of these stone discs, which you then place in a highly visible position to sort of show your neighbors that your clan's kicked some ass and really has their act together. So the money is part of this idea of public wealth. In this regard, it's sort of similar to what you find in Melanesia with the idea of dolphins' teeth and all the traditional money that we saw that the guys were talking about when they're talking about gift giving. You can also give money, the Yappies money, if you want to really just sort of hammer a group by giving them one of these things, because you probably won't be able to pay it back. So again, this highly ritualized money, what makes it really striking here is these things are huge. I mean, some of these things weigh, I believe, a ton and a half. You know, you're talking like a stone wheel that's up to 4, 5, 6 feet tall. So you don't exactly put that in the back of the car and drive around with it. So all of this is very much part of this whole sort of traditional system. The Europeans were sort of vaguely fascinated with this because they saw it as money in the Western sense. And I think the thought was, from their standpoint, it was, you know, very primitive and sort of silly that the locals would actually have money that was made of large pieces of stone, not realizing they really served an entirely different function. But that's, you know, but again, it says some Europeans really didn't get into any sort of detail. They just weren't that interested. Let's see, let me segment it here. Okay. This is probably the most fascinating area in this part of the whole part of the Pacific, the island of Yap. Sort of halfway between Palau on one hand and Guam on the other. What's really interesting about Yap is it drives geologists crazy, because the Yap Islands, which is sort of really one island, there's some little clustered pieces, is a real puzzle because it's actually a piece of continental real estate that actually looks like part of Siberia. Well, in fact, here, if you look at this image, you can actually see here's some of your money. Here's a money here. These are small ones here. There's a whole slew of the money. So the puzzle about the Yapese Islands is that they're not from this part of the Pacific. This material that makes up the Yapese Islands is actually from about 1,500, 2,000 miles to the northwest. How it got here, you know, what it's doing there, I don't know. You know, your guess is as good as any. It's just geologists, it really irritates the crap out of geologists because it doesn't make any sense. So Yap's an interesting in that regard. It's also, as we'll see, a huge puzzle because to anthropologists it drives them crazy. Yap's famous as, I'm not sure how you measure this, but on a per person basis, Yapese society is actually in some ways the most complicated or complex in the world in terms of relationships, how people operate, how they function in the world around them. It's an incredibly complicated place to the extent that much of Yapese culture really can't be explained very effectively to folks outside of Yap. And that includes other Micronesians. Folks in Palau and other places that interact with the Yapese a lot. Yap is just sort of this huge question mark. It's sort of like the Yapese do whatever they do, and you just sort of go, okay. But trying to make sense of it just doesn't happen. So sort of part of that is the catch for next time, since Yap is probably a good thing to go over in a group in the meetup. So go back to this. So, sorry, I sort of screwed this up. I got to change the order of these things. When we look at generalities, in other words, what you find throughout Micronesia. Now, remember, unlike Polynesia, this isn't a package deal. So this isn't a group of cultures that are just basic variations on a theme. These places are really, really different from one area to the region, especially from the west to the east, which makes sense because there's different things playing on them. But there are some commonalities. So here's the commonalities. Again, let's come right off the PowerPoint here. Again, I mentioned the idea of clans. Avuncular local residence, that's a term that we use in cultural anthropology when it talks about who you hang out with. People globally in societies tend to hang out with people who can get them stuff. So you're going to hang around people that give you access to resources or will support you, whatever. That's sort of a, you know, it's a thing about it. It's a totally practical thing. You're going to spend time schmoozing the people that can help you. In most of Micronesia, what that actually means is your mother's brother. So avuncular local means that you hang around with your mother's brother, i.e. your uncle, on your mom's side of the family. This is really, really common throughout much of Micronesia. And this was actually the basis of, for example, childbearing. So in much of Micronesia, right down to relatively recently, your mother's brother would be, to a certain extent, your dad. They would be the ones that, especially when it came to disciplining kids, intentionally raising and training the kid, that would usually be the job of your mother's brother, i.e. your uncle. That wouldn't be the job of your biological dad. Because if you think about it, your biological dad he's going to be his sister's brother. So he's going to have his own set of kids. He's going to have his set of kids, which are his sister's kids, which he raises. So, to a Western concept, it's sort of like the nuclear family is screwed up, in the sense that the women stay the same, but the men who are the father figure, I don't know, childbearing figure, are generally going to be the mother's brothers. And so when you think about it, it sort of makes sense. You've got a female-dominated system, so the women are going to trust the guys they know the best, which are their brothers, because they grew up with them. So they're the ones, and they know their brothers know how it's supposed to be done. So that's the guy that does the work. That's the guy that's expected to help the kids out when they get older. He'll be the one that will train them if they're boys. He'll be the one that will give them stuff and teach them how to do stuff. So the birth or blood family is the one that raises kids, not the marriage family. So this is diametrically opposed to at least 50% from the American system, which is the marriage family. Mom and dad are the ones that raise the kid. So here, your genealogy and birth kinship is what defines the family group. Now, as you can imagine, this causes a huge amount of trouble in the 19th, 20th century, 21st century, because of course in the German, the Japanese, and the American context, it's the mom and the dad, it's the nuclear family that raise kids. So what you find is the traditional systems throughout all this region are that your mother's brother, i.e. your uncle, will raise you. And all of a sudden you find yourself in a system that just totally ignores that and basically says, no, your dad's going to raise you. Hegel Hazel in his book that you got points this out. I think it's quite accurate, that this is one of the main reasons there's so much trouble in terms of family abuse and problems in Micronesian societies, is that you put roles of child rearing on especially men, but it's to the wrong kids. So everything they've grown up with says that you deal with these group of kids. The modern westernized system says that you should deal with another group of kids. And so if you think about, the women are going to be very happy when their husbands, who they see sort of like husbands-in-law, are the ones telling the kids what to do, because that's the prerogative of their brothers. Likewise, the husbands-in-law, the Western husband, finds himself in a position of authority with people he really doesn't have a lot of oomph with. So in many cases, just sort of like, fine. So what happens is the role of male figures, male-dominant, male childbearing figures, is very ambiguous in much of Micronesia and has a lot of childbearing issues, especially when you've also cut the women's power off at the knees, sort of by virtue of Western impact. So traditionally, women had power. Men's job was to support their sisters, to act as sort of like the enforcers, if you would, of the power of the women. So men's power was through their genealogy and their mom's side of the family. As in Polynesia and Melanesia, every place was named. Every place had an ancestor, some reason for its existence. What happens, though, is in Micronesia, there's not the same sense that property can only belong to the descendants of ancestors. A lot of the ancestors, or a lot of the ancestral places sort of get dislocated. So it's an ancestor or something made a place, but that ancestor really doesn't have kids. So you sort of, it'd be like if you had Kamapuaa or Pele here, but there was no one who was a descendant of them anymore. So a place might belong to Kamapuaa, but it's not controlled by his family because he doesn't have any kids. So basically, it's important because it was a place where somebody who was important did something, almost like a Western idea. George Washington slept here. So in that regard, it makes it real different than Melanesia and Polynesia. So what you find is throughout most of Polynesia, is a lot of times it almost sounds like a bunch of realtors. They're very, very interested and very aggressive about acquiring property that has stories attached to it because it's a named place, therefore it has value. And so one of the main reasons that families gain power is by controlling as many of these valuable places as possible. Now, like the idea of Black Point or something like that today here in Hawaii, these places aren't places of food production. They're just places that have stories attached to them. So a clan could have a lot of named places. So they could be a very prestigious clan, and yet have almost no land that was actually good for growing food. So there's sort of this weird disconnect between the land and the value of the land and the need for clans to control the land. This makes it very different than Polynesia, where you're going to find that land tend to be tied to production. So in Micronesia, that's not the case. Having said that, even today, you find out, for example, in the courts in Palau, I believe something like 40% of the cases they hear in the courts are clans or families suing each other over pieces of property that have names attached to them, have value attached to them. Even though it might just be a rock or a little chunk of a peninsula or something like that, it has no value intrinsically, but it has a reputation. What's sort of interesting about these places is that unlike their Polynesian and Melanesian counterparts, a lot of them don't appear to have any link to mana. So it's not like a lot of these places don't tend to have a lot of power in them. They're just places where it has a name and a story. Or it could be, because of the European influences, we've lost the idea of mana attached to it. We don't know. So, puzzle. You find in much of Micronesia really rigid systems of authority. The rule of the senior women over the younger women, the guys and everything is totally almost like the military. So in that regard, it's sort of like what happens in Hawaii in the 1700s. A very structured, very regulated system where people are born into a position and pretty much stay in it. So a lot of Micronesian societies, until we get in the Far East section, are pretty seriously built down structured. And this has all sorts of consequences, not the least of which is I think it made it rather fragile when the Europeans come in and basically dump the whole thing on its head. You don't have the idea of flexibility in terms of opportunism taking place. So when it does happen, the system's not really very able to deal with it. Throughout a lot of this region, and again, very similar to what you find both in the Philippines, but also in Melanesia, there's a lot of power held by folks who do sorcery, magic. Most of these folks would be called shamans. This is typical throughout all of Micronesia. So what you don't see necessarily is the senior members of the family interacting with ancestors who control mana. What you'll find is someone with virtue of a set of attributes, skills, abilities, whatever, is the person that does that. Now, this is sort of similar in some ways in which you see in Melanesia in some areas. But in Melanesia, a lot of what people interact with is very specifically to their ancestor. I'm not sure if this is a change that occurred recently with the Europeans or if it's been there for a while. What you find in contemporary Micronesian societies is there are people who do magic, who do sorcery, who are very, very powerful. And that's been ritualized for at least 100-something years. Now, if you get into Palau, but especially Guam, the Marianas group, these in the modern term have been called folk healers. That's probably to keep them from getting burned at the stake. And it's just as a note, we'll get to Guam next time. In Guam, they still had the Inquisition going into, I believe, the 1760s, way after it disappeared in Europe. So what you had was folk healers was a safe way to do magic without finding yourself, being crucified by the Catholic Church. So folk healers are the term most of these folks go by in most of Micronesia, but you don't find a lot of them, but you find them used a lot. And this appears to be some variant form of what's been around for a long time because people are more comfortable with it in terms of this is a normal way you would deal with illness or some other situation. You get one of these folks to do it. It might not necessarily be in your family or your clan. So again, this is not one of those puzzles. We know it, we know it happens, we don't know particularly why. So that cheerful group of confusion, I guess we'll stop for today.